Book 2, Part 3. Number 5. After this they reached the river Zapatas, which is 400 feet broad, and here they halted 3 days. During the interval suspicions were rife, though no act of treachery displayed itself. Clearchus accordingly resolved to bring to an end these feelings of mistrust before they led to war. Consequently he sent a messenger to the Persian to say that he desired an interview with him, to which the other readily consented. As soon as they were met, Clearchus spoke as follows: "Tissaphernes," he said, "I do not forget that oaths have been exchanged between us, and right hands shaken, in token that we will abstain from mutual injury. But I can see that you watch us narrowly as if we were foes, and we, seeing this, watch you narrowly in return. But as I fail to discover, after investigation, that you are endeavouring to do us a mischief, and I am quite sure that nothing of the sort has ever entered our heads with regard to you, the best plan seemed to me to come and talk the matter over with you, so that, if possible, we might dispel the mutual distrust on either side. For I have known people ere now, the victims in some cases of calumny, or possibly of mere suspicion, who, in apprehension of one another and eager to deal the first blow, have committed irreparable wrong against those who neither intended nor so much as harboured a thought of mischief against them. I have come to you under a conviction that such misunderstandings may best be put a stop to by personal intercourse, and I wish to instruct you plainly that you are wrong in mistrusting us. The first and weightiest reason is that the oath, which we took in the sight of heaven, are a barrier to mutual hostility. I envy not the man whose conscience tells him that he has disregarded these. For in a war with heaven by what swiftness of foot can a man escape? In what quarter find refuge? In what darkness slink away and be hid? To what strong fortress scale and be out of reach? Are not all things in all ways subject to the gods? Is not their lordship over all alike outspread? As touching the gods, therefore, and our oaths, that is how I view this matter. To their safekeeping we consign the friendship which we solemnly contracted. But turning to matters human, you I look upon as our greatest blessing in this present time. With you every path is plain to us, every river passable, and of provisions we shall know no stint. But without you all our way is through darkness, for we know nothing concerning it. Every river will be an obstacle, each multitude a terror. But worst terror of all, the vast wilderness so full of endless perplexity. Nay, if in a fit of madness we murdered you, what then? In slaying our benefactor, should we not have challenged to enter the lists against us a more formidable antagonist in the king himself? Let me tell you how many high hopes I should rob myself of were I to take in hand to do you mischief. I coveted the friendship of Cyrus. I believed him to be abler than any man of his day to benefit those whom he chose. But today I look, and behold it is you who are in his place. The power which belonged to Cyrus and his territory are yours now. You have them, and your own satrapy besides, safe and sound; while the king's power, which was a thorn in the side of Cyrus, is your support. This being so, it would be madness not to wish to be your friend. But I will go further, and state to you the reasons of my confidence that you on your side will desire our friendship. I know that the Mysians are a cause of trouble to you, and I flatter myself that with my present force I could render them humbly obedient to you. This applies to the Pisidians also, and I am told there are many other such tribes besides. I think I can deal with them all. They shall cease from being a constant disturbance to your peace and prosperity. Then there are the Egyptians. I know your anger against them today is very great. Nor can I see what better force you will find to help you in chastising them than this which marches at my back today. Again, if you seek the friendship of any of your neighbours round, there shall be no friend so great as you. If any one annoys you, with us as your faithful servitors you shall be lorded over him. And such service we will render you, not as hirelings merely for pay's sake, but for the gratitude which we shall rightly feel to you, to whom we owe our lives. As I dwell on these matters, I confess the idea of your feeling mistrust of us is so astonishing that I would give much to discover the name of the man who is so clever of speech that he can persuade you that we harbor designs against you." Clearchus ended, and Tissaphernes responded thus: "I am glad, Clearchus, to listen to your sensible remarks, for with the sentiments you hold, if you were to devise any mischief against me, it could only be out of malevolence to yourself. But if you imagine that you, on your side, have any better reason to mistrust the king and me than we you, listen to me in turn, and I will undeceive you. I ask you, does it seem to you that we lack the means, if we had the will, to destroy you? Have we not horsemen enough, or infantry, or whatever other arm you like, whereby we may be able to injure you, without risk of suffering in return? Or possibly, do we seem to you to lack the physical surroundings suitable for attacking you? Do you not see all these great plains which you would find it hard enough to traverse even when they are friendly? And all yonder great mountain chains left for you to cross, which we can at any time occupy in advance and render impassable? And all those rivers on whose banks we can deal craftily by you, checking and controlling and choosing the right number of you whom we care to fight? Nay, there are some which you will not be able to cross at all unless we transport you to the other side. And if at all these points we were worsted, yet fire, as they say, is stronger than the fruit of the field. We can burn it down and call up famine in arms against you, against which you, for all your bravery, will never be able to contend. Why, then, with all these avenues of attack, this machinery of war open to us, not one of which can be turned against ourselves, why should we select from among them all that method which alone in the sight of God is impious and of man abominable? Surely it belongs to people altogether without resources, who are helplessly struggling in the toils of fate, and are villains to boot, to seek accomplishment of their desires by perjury to heaven and faithlessness to their fellows. We are not so unreasoning, Clearchus, nor so foolish. Why, when we had it in our power to destroy you, did we not proceed to do it? Know well that the cause of this was nothing less than my passion to prove myself faithful to the Hellenes, and that, as Cyrus went up, relying on a foreign force attracted by payment, I in turn might go down strong in the same through service rendered. Various ways in which you Hellenes may be useful to me you yourself have mentioned, but there is one still greater. It is the great king's privilege alone to wear the tiara upright upon his head. Yet in your presence it may be given to another mortal to wear it upright, here, upon his heart. Throughout this speech he seemed to Clearchus to be speaking the truth, and he rejoined, "Then are not those worthy of the worst penalties who, in spite of all that exists to cement our friendship, endeavour by slander to make us enemies?" "Even so," replied Tissaphernes, "and if your generals and captains care to come in some open and public way, I will name to you those who tell me that you are plotting against me and the army under me." "Good," replied Clearchus, "I will bring all, and I will show you, on my side, the source from which I derive my information concerning you." After this conversation, Tissaphernes with kindliest expression invited Clearchus to remain with him at the time, and entertained him at dinner. Next day Clearchus returned to the camp, and made no secret of his persuasion that he at any rate stood high in the affections of Tissaphernes, and he reported what he had said, insisting that those invited ought to go to Tissaphernes, and that any Hellene convicted of calumnious language ought to be punished, not only as traitors themselves, but as disaffected to their fellow countrymen. The slanderer and traducer was Menon. So at any rate he suspected, because he knew that he had had meetings with Tissaphernes whilst he was with Aries, and was factiously opposed to himself, plotting how to win over the whole army to him as a means of winning the good graces of Tissaphernes. But Clearchus wanted the entire army to give its mind to no one else, and that refractory people should be put out of the way. Some of the soldiers protested. The captains and generals had better not all go. It was better not to put too much confidence in Tissaphernes. But Clearchus insisted so strongly that finally it was arranged for 5 generals to go and 20 captains. These were accompanied by about 200 of the other soldiers, who took the opportunity of marketing. On arrival at the doors of Tissaphernes's quarters, the generals were summoned inside. They were Proxenus the Boeotian, Menon the Thessalian, Aegeus the Arcadian, Clearchus the Laconian, and Socrates the Achaean, while the captains remained at the doors. Not long after that, at one and the same signal, those within were seized and those without cut down, after which some of the barbarian horsemen galloped over the plain, killing every Hellene they encountered, bond or free. The Hellenes, as they looked from the camp, viewed that strange horsemanship with surprise, and could not explain to themselves what it all meant, until Nicarchus the Arcadian came tearing along for bare life with a wound in the belly, and clutching his protruding entrails in his hands. He told them all that had happened. Instantly the Hellenes ran to their arms, one and all, in utter consternation, and fully expecting that the enemy would instantly be down upon the camp. However, they did not all come. Only Arrhaeus came, and Artaeozus, and Mithridates, who were Cyrus's most faithful friends, but the interpreter of the Hellenes said he saw and recognized the brother of Tissaphernes also with them. They had at their back other Persians also, armed with cuirasses, as many as 300. As soon as they were within a short distance, they bade any general or captain of the Hellenes who might be there to approach and hear a message from the king. After this, 2 Hellene generals went out with all precaution. These were Cleonel the Orchomenian, and Sophonetus the Stymphalian, attended by Xenophon the Athenian, who went to learn news of Proxenus. Chrysophus was at the time away in a village with a party gathering provisions. As soon as they had halted within earshot, Arrhaeus said, "Hellenes, Clearchus being shown to have committed perjury and to have broken the truce, has suffered the penalty, and he is dead. But Proxenus and Menon, in return for having given information of his treachery, are in high esteem and honour. As to yourselves, the king demands your arms. He claims them as his, since they belong to Cyrus, who was his slave." To this the Hellenes made answer by the mouth of Cleonor of Orchomenus, their spokesman, who said, addressing Arrhaeus, "Thou villain, Arrhaeus, and you the rest of you, who were Cyrus's friends, have you no shame before God or man, first to swear to us that you have the same friends and the same enemies as we ourselves, and then to turn and betray us, making common cause with Tissaphernes, that most impious and villainous of men? With him you have murdered the very man to whom you gave your solemn word and oath, and to the rest of us turned traitors, and, having so done, you join hand with our enemies to come against us." Arrhaeus answered, "There is no doubt but that Clearchus has been known for some time to harbour designs against Tissaphernes and Orontas, and all of us who side with them." Taking up this assertion, Xenophon said, "Well then, granting that Clearchus broke the truce contrary to our oaths, he has his deserts, for perjurers deserve to perish. But where are Proxenus and Menon, our generals and your good friends and benefactors, as you admit? Send them back to us. Surely, just because they are friends of both parties, they will try to give us the best advice for you and for us." At this, the Asiatics stood discussing with one another for a long while, and then they went away without vouchsafing a word. 6. The generals who were thus seized were taken up to the king and there decapitated. The first of these, Clearchus, was a thorough soldier and a true lover of fighting. This is the testimony of all who knew him intimately. As long as the war between the Lacedaemonians and Athenians lasted, he could find occupation at home, but after the peace he persuaded his own city that the Thracians were injuring the Hellenes, and having secured his object set sail, empowered by the Ephorate to make war upon the Thracians north of the Chersonese and Perinthus. But he had no sooner fairly started than, for some reason or other, the Ephors changed their minds and endeavoured to bring him back again from the isthmus. Thereupon he refused further obedience and went off with sails set for the Hellespont. In consequence he was condemned to death by the Spartan authorities for disobedience to orders, and now, finding himself in exile, he came to Cyrus. Working on the feelings of that prince, in language described elsewhere, he received from his entertainer a present of 10,000 darics. Having got his money, he did not sink into a life of ease and indolence, but collected an army with it, carried on war against the Thracians, and conquered them in battle, and from that date onwards harried and plundered them with war incessantly, until Cyrus wanted his army, whereupon he at once went off, in hopes of finding another sphere of warfare in his company. These, I take it, were the characteristic acts of a man whose affections are set on warfare. When it is open to him to enjoy peace with honor, no shame, no injury attached, still he prefers war. When he may live at home at ease, he insists on toil, if only it may end in fighting. When it is given to him to keep his riches without risk, he would rather lessen his fortune by the pastime of battle. To put it briefly, war was his mistress. Just as another man will spend his fortune on a favorite, or to gratify some pleasure, so he chose to squander his substance on soldiering. But if the life of a soldier was a passion with him, he was none the less a soldier born, as herein appears. Danger was a delight to him, he courted it, attacking the enemy by night or by day, and in difficulties he did not lose his head, as all who ever served in a campaign with him would with one consent allow. A good soldier. The question arises, was he equally good as a commander? It must be admitted that, as far as was compatible with his quality of temper, he was, none more so. Capable to a singular degree of devising how his army was to get supplies, and of actually getting them, he was also capable of impressing upon those about him that Clearchus must be obeyed, and that he brought about by the very hardness of his nature. With a scowling expression and a harshly grating voice, he chastised with severity, and at times with such fury that he was sorry afterwards himself for what he had done. Yet it was not without purpose that he applied the whip. He had a theory that there was no good to be got out of an unchastened army. A saying of his is recorded to the effect that the soldier who is to mount guard and keep his hands off his friends, and be ready to dash without a moment's hesitation against a foe, must fear his commander more than the enemy. Accordingly, in any strait, this was the man whom the soldiers were eager to obey, and they would have no other in his place. The cloud which lay upon his brow at those times lit up with brightness, his face became radiant, and the old sternness was so charged with vigor and knitted strength to meet the foe, that it savoured of salvation, not of cruelty. But when the pinch of danger was past, and it was open to them to go and taste subordination under some other officer, many forsook him. So lacking in grace of manner was he, but was ever harsh and savage, so that the feeling of the soldiers towards him was that of schoolboys to a master. In other words, though it was not his good fortune ever to have followers inspired solely by friendship or goodwill, yet those who found themselves under him, either by state appointment or through want, or other arch necessity, yielded him implicit obedience. From the moment that he led them to victory, the elements which went to make his soldiers efficient were numerous enough. There was the feeling of confidence in facing the foe, which never left them, and there was the dread of punishment at his hands to keep them orderly. In this way and to this extent he knew how to rule. But to play a subordinate part himself he had no great taste. So at any rate it was said. At the time of his death he must have been about 50 years of age. Proxenus, the Boeotian, was of a different temperament. It had been the dream of his boyhood to become a man capable of great achievements. In obedience to this passionate desire it was that he paid his fee to Gorgias of Leontini. After enjoying that teacher's society, he flattered himself that he must be at once qualified to rule, and while he was on friendly terms with the leaders of the age, he was not to be outdone in reciprocity of service. In this mood he threw himself into the projects of Cyrus, and in return expected to derive from this essay the reward of a great name, large power, and wide wealth. But for all that he pitched his hopes so high, it was none the less evident that he would refuse to gain any of the ends he set before him wrongfully. Righteously and honourably he would obtain them, if he might, or else forego them. As a commander he had the art of leading gentlemen, but he failed to inspire adequately either respect for himself or fear in the soldiers under him. Indeed, he showed a more delicate regard for his soldiers than his subordinates for him, and he was indisputably more apprehensive of incurring their hatred than they were of losing their fidelity. The one thing needful to real and recognized generalship was, he thought, to praise the virtuous and to withhold praise from the evildoer. It can be easily understood, then, that of those who were brought in contact with him, the good and noble indeed were his well-wishers, but he laid himself open to the machinations of the base, who looked upon him as a person to be dealt with as they liked. At the time of his death he was only 30 years of age. As to Menon the Thessalian, the mainspring of his action was obvious. What he sought after insatiably was wealth. Rule he sought after only as a stepping-stone to larger spoils. Honours and high estate he craved for simply that he might extend the area of his gains, and if he studied to be on friendly terms with the powerful, it was in order that he might commit wrong with impunity. The shortest road to the achievement of his desires lay, he thought, through false swearing, lying, and cheating, for in his vocabulary simplicity and truth were synonyms of folly. Natural affection he clearly entertained for nobody. If he called a man his friend, it might be looked upon as certain that he was bent on ensnaring him. Laughter at an enemy he considered out of place, but his whole conversation turned upon the ridicule of his associates. In like manner the possessions of his foes were secure from his designs, since it was no easy task, he thought, to steal from people on their guard. But it was his particular good fortune to have discovered how easy it is to rob a friend in the midst of his security. If it were a perjured person or a wrongdoer, he dreaded him as well armed and entrenched, but the honourable and the truth-loving he tried to practise on, regarding them as weaklings devoid of manhood. And as other men pride themselves on piety and truth and righteousness, so Menon prided himself on a capacity for fraud, on the fabrication of lies, on the mockery and scorn of friends. The man who was not a rogue he ever looked upon as only half-educated. Did he aspire to the first place in another man's friendship, he set about his object by slandering those who stood nearest to him in affection. He contrived to secure the obedience of his soldiers by making himself an accomplice in their misdeeds, and the fluency with which he vaunted his own capacity and readiness for enormous guilt was a sufficient title to be honoured and courted by them. Or if any one stood aloof from him, he set it down as a meritorious act of kindness on his part that during their intercourse he had not robbed him of existence. As to certain obscure charges brought against his character, these may certainly be fabrications. I confine myself to the following facts, which are known to all. He was in the bloom of youth when he procured from Aristippus the command of his mercenaries. He had not yet lost that bloom when he became exceedingly intimate with Ariaeus, a barbarian, whose liking for fair young men was the explanation, and before he had grown a beard himself, he had contracted a similar relationship with a bearded favourite named Therapes. When his fellow generals were put to death on the plea that they had marched with Cyrus against the king, he alone, although he had shared their conduct, was exempted from their fate. But after their death the vengeance of the king fell upon him, and he was put to death, not like Clearchus and the others by what would appear to be the speediest of deaths, decapitation, but, as report says, he lived for a year in pain and disgrace, and died the death of a felon. Agis the Arcadian and Socrates the Archean were both among the sufferers who were put to death. To the credit, be it said, of both, no one ever derided either as cowardly in war, no one ever had a fault to find with either on the score of friendship. They were about 35 years of age. End of Book 2.
Book 3, Part 1. Number 1. After the generals had been seized, and the captains and soldiers who formed their escort had been killed, the Hellenes lay in deep perplexity, a prey to painful reflections. Here were they at the king's gates, and on every side environing them were many hostile cities and tribes of men. Who was there now to furnish them with a market? Separated from Hellas by more than 1,000 miles, they had not even a guide to point the way. Impassable rivers lay athwart their homeward route and hemmed them in. Betrayed even by the Asiatics, at whose side they had marched with Cyrus to the attack, they were left in isolation. Without a single mounted trooper to aid them in pursuit, was it not perfectly plain that if they won a battle, their enemies would escape to a man? but if they were beaten themselves, not one soul of them would survive. Haunted by such thoughts, and with hearts full of despair, but few of them tasted food that evening, but few of them kindled even a fire, and many never came into camp at all that night, but took their rest where each chanced to be. They could not close their eyes for very pain and yearning after their fatherlands or their parents, the wife or child whom they never expected to look upon again. Such was the plight in which each and all tried to seek repose. Now there was in that host a certain man, an Athenian, Xenophon, who had accompanied Cyrus neither as a general, nor as an officer, nor yet as a private soldier, but simply on the invitation of an old friend, Proxenus. This old friend had sent to fetch him from home, promising, if he would come, to introduce him to Cyrus, whom, said Proxenus, I consider to be worth my fatherland and more to me. Xenophon, having read the letter, consulted Socrates, the Athenian, whether he should accept or refuse the invitation. Socrates, who had a suspicion that the state of Athens might in some way look askance at my friendship with Cyrus, whose zealous co-operation with the Lacedaemonians against Athens in the war was not forgotten, advised Xenophon to go to Delphi, and there to consult the god as to the desirability of such a journey. Xenophon went and put the question to Apollo, to which of the gods he must pray and do sacrifice, so that he might best accomplish his intended journey, and return in safety with good fortune. Then Apollo answered him, To such and such gods must thou do sacrifice. And when he had returned home, he reported to Socrates the oracle. But he, when he heard, blamed Xenophon, that he had not, in the first instance, inquired of the god whether it were better for him to go or to stay, but had taken on himself to settle that point affirmatively, by inquiring straightway how he might best perform the journey. Since, however, continued Socrates, you did so put the question, you should do what the god enjoined. Thus, and without further ado, Xenophon offered sacrifice to those whom the god had named, and set sail on his voyage. He overtook Proxenus and Cyrus at Sardis, when they were just ready to start on the march up country, and was at once introduced to Cyrus. Proxenus eagerly pressed him to stop, a request which Cyrus with like ardour supported, adding that as soon as the campaign was over he would send him home. The campaign referred to was understood to be against the Pisidians. That is how Xenophon came to join the expedition, deceived indeed, though not by Proxenus, who was equally in the dark with the rest of the Hellenes, not counting Clearchus, as to the intended attack upon the king. Then, though the majority were in apprehension of the journey, which was not at all to their minds, yet, for very shame of one another and Cyrus, they continued to follow him, and with the rest went Xenophon. And now in this season of perplexity, he too, with the rest, was in sore distress, and could not sleep. But anon, getting a snatch of sleep, he had a dream. It seemed to him in a vision that there was a storm of thunder and lightning, and a bolt fell on his father's house, and thereupon the house was all in a blaze. He sprung up in terror, and pondering the matter, decided that in part the dream was good, in that he had seen a great light from Zeus, whilst in the midst of toil and danger; but partly too he feared it, for evidently it had come from Zeus the king, and the fire kindled all around. What could that mean, but that he was hemmed in by various perplexities, and so could not escape from the country of the king? The full meaning, however, is to be discovered from what happened after the dream. This is what took place. As soon as he was fully awake, the first clear thought which came into his head was, "Why am I lying here? The night advances, with the day it is like enough the enemy will be upon us. If we are to fall into the hands of the king, what is left us but to face the most horrible of sights, and to suffer the most fearful pains, and then to die, insulted, an ignominious death? to defend ourselves, to ward off that fate. Not a hand stirs, no one is preparing, none cares. But here we lie, as though it were time to rest and take our ease. I too, what am I waiting for? A general to undertake the work? And from what city? Am I waiting till I am older myself and of riper age? Older I shall never be, if today I betray myself to my enemies." Thereupon he got up, and called together first Proxenus's officers. And when they were met, he said, "Sleep, sirs, I cannot, nor can you, I fancy, nor lie here longer, when I see in what straits we are. Our enemy, we may be sure, did not open war upon us till he felt he had everything amply ready. Yet none of us chose a corresponding anxiety to enter the lists of battle in the bravest style. And yet, if we yield ourselves and fall into the king's power, need we ask what our fate will be? This man, who, when his own brother, the son of the same parents, was dead, was not content with that, but severed head and hand from the body, and nailed them to a cross. We then, who have not even the tie of blood in our favour, but who marched against him, meaning to make a slave of him instead of a king, and to slay him if we could, what is likely to be our fate at his hands? Will he not go all lengths so that, by inflicting on us the extreme of ignominy and torture, he may rouse in the rest of mankind a terror of ever marching against him any more? There is no question but that our business is to avoid by all means getting into his clutches. For my part, all the while the truce lasted, I never ceased pitying ourselves and congratulating the king and those with him, as, like a helpless spectator, I surveyed the extent and quality of their territory, the plenteousness of their provisions, the multitude of their dependents, their cattle, their gold, and their apparel. And then to turn and ponder the condition of our soldiers, without part or lot in these good things, except we bought it. Few, I knew, had any longer the wherewithal to buy, and yet our oath held us down, so that we could not provide ourselves otherwise than by purchase. I say, as I reasoned thus, there were times when I dreaded the truce more than I now dread war. Now, however, that they have abruptly ended the truce, there is an end also to their own insolence and to our suspicion. All these good things of theirs are now set as prizes for the combatants. To whichsoever of us shall prove the better men, will they fall as guerdons, and the gods themselves are the judges of the strife. The gods, who full surely will be on our side, seeing it is our enemies who have taken their names falsely, whilst we, with much to law us, yet for our oath's sake, and the gods who are our witnesses, sternly held aloof. So that, it seems to me, we have a right to enter upon this contest, with much more heart than our foes, and further, we are possessed of bodies more capable than theirs of bearing cold and heat and labour. Souls too we have, by the help of heaven, better and braver. Nay, the men themselves are more vulnerable, more mortal than ourselves, if so be the gods vouchsafe to give us victory once again. Howbeit, for I doubt not elsewhere similar reflections are being made, whatsoever betide, let us not, in heaven's name, wait for others to come and challenge us to noble deeds. Let us rather take the lead in stimulating the rest to valour. Show yourselves to be the bravest of officers, and among generals the worthiest to command. For myself, if you choose to start forwards on this quest, I will follow; or, if you bid me lead you, my age shall be no excuse to stand between me and your orders. At least I am of full age, I take it, to avert misfortune from my own head." Such were the speaker's words. And the officers, when they heard, all with one exception, called upon him to put himself at their head. This was a certain Apollonides, there present, who spoke in the Boeotian dialect. This man's opinion was that it was mere nonsense for any one to pretend they could obtain safety, otherwise than by an appeal to the king, if he had skill to enforce it, and at the same time he began to dilate on the difficulties. But Xenophon cut him short. O most marvellous of men! Though you have eyes to see, you do not perceive. Though you have ears to hear, you do not recollect. You were present with the rest of us now here when, after the death of Cyrus, the king, vaunting himself on that occurrence, sent dictatorially to bid us lay down our arms. But when we, instead of giving up our arms, put them on and went and pitched our camp near him, his manner changed. It is hard to say what he did not do. He was so at his wits' end, sending us embassies and begging for a truce and furnishing provisions the while, until he had got it. Or to take the contrary instance, when just now, acting precisely on your principles, our generals came and captains went, trusting to the truce, unarmed to a conference with them. What came of it? What is happening at this instant? Beaten, goaded with pricks, insulted, poor souls, they cannot even die, though death, I ween, would be very sweet. And you, who know all this, how can you say that it is mere nonsense to talk of self-defence? How can you bid us go again and try the arts of persuasion? In my opinion, sirs, we ought not to admit this fellow to the same rank with ourselves. Rather ought we to deprive him of his captaincy, and load him with packs, and treat him as such. The man is a disgrace to his own fatherland, and the whole of Hellas, that being a Hellene he is what he is. Here Agasius the Stymphalian broke in, exclaiming, "Nay, this fellow has no connection either with Boeotia or with Hellas, none whatever. I have noted both his ears bored like a Lydian's." And so it was. Him then they banished. But the rest visited the ranks, and wherever a general was left, they summoned the general. Where he was gone, the lieutenant general. And where again the captain alone was left, the captain. As soon as they were all met, they seated themselves in front of the Place d'Armes, the assembled generals and officers, numbering about 100. It was nearly midnight when this took place. Thereupon Hieronymus the Elean, the eldest of Proxenus's captains, commenced speaking as follows: "Generals and captains, it seemed right to us, in view of the present crisis, ourselves to assemble and to summon you, that we might advise upon some practicable course. Would you, Xenophon, repeat what you said to us?" Thereupon Xenophon spoke as follows: "We all know only too well that the king and Tissaphernes have seized as many of us as they could, and it is clear they are plotting to destroy the rest of us if they can. Our business is plain. It is to do all we can to avoid getting into the power of the barbarians. Rather, if we can, we will get them into our power. Rely upon this then, all you who are here assembled. Now is your great opportunity. The soldiers outside have their eyes fixed upon you. If they think that you are faint-hearted, they will turn cowards. But if you show them that you are making your own preparations to attack the enemy, and setting an example to the rest, follow you, be assured, they will. Imitate you, they will. Maybe it is but right and fair that you should somewhat excel them, for you are generals, you are commanders of brigades or regiments. And if, while it was peace, you had the advantage in wealth and position, so now, when it is war, you are expected to rise superior to the common herd, to think for them, to toil for them, whenever there be need. At this very moment you would confer a great boon on the army, if you made it your business to appoint generals and officers to fill the places of those that are lost. For without leaders nothing good or noble, to put it concisely, was ever wrought anywhere, and in military matters this is absolutely true. For if discipline is held to be of saving virtue, the want of it has been the ruin of many ere now. Well then, when you have appointed all the commanders necessary, it would only be opportune, I take it, if you were to summon the rest of the soldiers and speak some words of encouragement. Even now, I dare say, you noticed yourselves the crestfallen air with which they came into camp, the despondency with which they fell to picket duty, so that, unless there is a change for the better, I do not know for what service they will be fit, whether by night, if need were, or even by day. The thing is to get them to turn their thoughts to what they mean to do, instead of to what they are likely to suffer. Do that and their spirits will soon revive wonderfully. You know, I need hardly remind you, it is not numbers or strength that gives victory in war, but, heaven helping them to one or other of two combatants, it is given to dash with stouter hearts to meet the foe, and such onset in 9 cases out of 10 those others refuse to meet. This observation also I have laid to heart, that they who in matters of war seek in all ways to save their lives are just they who, as a rule, die dishonourably, whereas they who, recognizing that death is the common lot and destiny of all men, strive hard to die nobly, these more frequently, as I observe, do after all attain to old age, or at any rate, while life lasts, they spend their days more happily. This lesson let all lay to heart this day, for we are just at such a crisis of our fate. Now is the season to be brave ourselves, and to stimulate the rest by our example." With these words he ceased, and after him Chrysippus said, "Xenophon, hitherto I knew only so much of you as that you were, I heard, an Athenian. But now I must commend you for your words and for your conduct. I hope that there may be many more like you, for it would prove a public blessing." Then turning to the officers, "And now," said he, "let us waste no time. Retire at once, I beg you, and choose leaders where you need them. After you have made your elections, come back to the middle of the camp and bring the newly appointed officers. After that, we will there summon a general meeting of the soldiers. Let Tolmides the herald," he added, "be in attendance." With these words on his lips, he got up, in order that what was needful might be done at once without delay. After this the generals were chosen. These were Timasian the Dardanian, in place of Clearchus; Xanthocles, an Achaean, in place of Socrates; Cleanor, an Arcadian, in place of Agis; Philesius, an Achaean, in place of Menon; and in place of Proxenus, Xenophon, the Athenian. End of Book 3, Part 1. Book 3, Part 2. Number 2. By the time the new generals had been chosen, the first faint glimmer of dawn had hardly commenced, as they met in the centre of the camp, and resolved to post an advance guard, and to call a general meeting of the soldiers. Now, when these had come together, Chrysippus the Lacedaemonian first rose and spoke as follows: "Fellow soldiers, the present posture of affairs is not pleasant, seeing that we are robbed of so many generals and captains and soldiers, and more than that, our former allies, Ariaeus and his men, have betrayed us. Still, we must rise above our circumstances to prove ourselves brave men, and not give in, but try to save ourselves by glorious victory if we can; or if not, at least to die gloriously, and never, while we have breath in our bodies, fall into the hands of our enemies, in which latter case, I fear, we shall suffer things which I pray the gods may visit rather upon those we hate." At this point, Cleanor, the Orchomenian, stood up and spoke as follows: "You see, men, the perjury and the impiety of the king. You see the faithlessness of Tissaphernes, professing that he was next door neighbour to Hellas, and would give a good deal to save us, in confirmation of which he took an oath to us himself, he gave us the pledge of his right hand, and then, with a lie upon his lips, this same man turned round and arrested our generals. He had no reverence even for Zeus, the god of strangers. But, after entertaining Clearchus at his own board as a friend, he used his hospitality to delude and decoy his victims. And Ariaeus, whom we offered to make king, with whom we exchanged pledges not to betray each other, even this man, without a particle of fear of the gods, or respect for Cyrus in his grave, though he was most honoured by Cyrus in lifetime, even he has turned aside to the worst foes of Cyrus, and is doing his best to injure the dead man's friends. Them may the gods requite as they deserve. But we, with these things before our eyes, will not any more be cheated and cajoled by them. We will make the best fight we can, and having made it, whatever the gods think fit to send, we will accept." After him, Xenophon arose. He was arrayed for war in his bravest apparel. "For," said he to himself, "if the gods grant victory, the finest attire will match with victory best; or if I must needs die, then for one who has aspired to be the noblest, it is well there should be some outward correspondence between his expectation and his end." He began his speech as follows: "Cleanor has spoken of the perjury and faithlessness of the barbarians, and you yourselves know them only too well, I fancy. If then we are minded to enter a second time into terms of friendship with them, with the experience of what our generals, who in all confidence entrusted themselves to their power, have suffered, reason would we should feel deep despondency. If, on the other hand, we purpose to take our good swords in our hands and to inflict punishment on them for what they have done, and from this time forward will be on terms of downright war with them, then, God helping, we have many a bright hope of safety." The words were scarcely spoken when some one sneezed, and with one impulse the soldiers bowed in worship, and Xenophon proceeded: "I propose, sirs, since, even as we spoke of safety, an omen from Zeus the Saviour has appeared, we vow a vow to sacrifice to the Saviour thank offerings for safe deliverance, wheresoever first we reach a friendly country; and let us couple with that vow another of individual assent, that we will offer to the rest of the gods according to our ability. Let all those who are in favour of this proposal hold up their hands." They all held up their hands, and there and then they vowed a vow and chanted the battle hymn. But as soon as these sacred matters were duly ended, he began once more thus: "I was saying that many and bright are the hopes we have of safety. First of all, we it is who confirm and ratify the oaths we take by heaven, but our enemies have taken false oaths and broken the truce, contrary to their solemn word. This being so, it is but natural that the gods should be opposed to our enemies, but with ourselves allied; the gods who are able to make the great ones quickly small, and out of sore perplexity can save the little ones with ease, what time it pleases them. In the next place, let me recall to your minds the dangers of our own forefathers, that you may see and know that bravery is your heirloom, and that by the aid of the gods brave men are rescued even out of the midst of sorest straits. So was it when the Persians came, and their attendant hosts, with a very great armament, to wipe out Athens from the face of the earth. The men of Athens had the heart to withstand them, and conquered them. Then they vowed to Artemis that for every man they slew of the enemy, they would sacrifice to the goddess goats so many; and when they could not find sufficient for the slain, they resolved to offer yearly 500, and to this day they perform that sacrifice. And at a somewhat later date, when Xerxes assembled his countless hosts and marched upon Hellas, then too our fathers conquered the forefathers of our foes by land and by sea. And proofs of these things are yet to be seen in trophies. But the greatest witness of all is the freedom of our cities, the liberty of that land in which you were born and bred. For you call no man master or lord. You bow your heads to none save to the gods alone. Such were your forefathers, and their sons are ye. Think not I am going to say that you put to shame in any way your ancestry. Far from it. Not many days since, you too were drawn up in battle face to face with these true descendants of their ancestors. And by the help of heaven you conquered them, though they many times outnumbered you. At that time it was to win a throne for Cyrus that you showed your bravery. Today, when the struggle is for your own salvation, what is more natural than that you should show yourselves braver and more zealous still? Nay, it is very meet and right that you should be more undaunted still today to face the foe. The other day, though you had not tested them, and before your eyes lay their immeasurable host, you had the heart to go against them with the spirit of your fathers. Today you have made trial of them, and knowing that, however many times your number, they do not care to await your onset, what concern have you now to be afraid of them? Nor let any one suppose that herein is a point of weakness, in that Cyrus's troops, who before were drawn up by your side, have now deserted us, for they are even worse cowards still than those we worsted. At any rate, they have deserted us, and sought refuge with them. Leaders of the forlorn hope of flight, far better is it to have them brigaded with the enemy than shoulder to shoulder in our ranks. But if any of you is out of heart to think that we have no cavalry, while the enemy have many squadrons to command, lay to heart this doctrine, that 10,000 horse only equal 10,000 men upon their backs, neither less nor more. Did any one ever die in battle from the bite or kick of a horse? It is the men, the real swordsmen, who do whatever is done in battles. In fact, we, on our stout shanks, are better mounted than those cavalry fellows. There they hang on to their horses' necks in mortal dread, not only of us, but of falling off, while we, well planted upon earth, can deal far heavier blows to our assailants, and aim more steadily at who we will. There is one point, I admit, in which their cavalry have the whip hand of us. It is safer for them than it is for us to run away. Maybe, however, you are in good heart about the fighting, but annoyed to think that Tissaphernes will not guide us any more, and that the king will not furnish us with a market any longer. Now consider, is it better for us to have a guide like Tissaphernes, whom we know to be plotting against us, or to take our chance of the stray people whom we catch and compel to guide us, who will know that any mistake made in leading us will be a sad mistake for their own lives? Again, is it better to be buying provisions in a market of their providing, in scant measure, and at high prices, without even the money to pay for them any longer, or, by right of conquest, to help ourselves, applying such measure as suits our fancy best? Or again, perhaps you admit that our present position is not without its advantages, but you feel sure that the rivers are a difficulty, and think that you were never more taken in than when you crossed them. If so, consider whether, after all, this is not perhaps the most foolish thing which the barbarians have done. No river is impassable throughout. Whatever difficulties it may present at some distance from its source, you need only make your way up to the spring head, and there you may cross it without wetting more than your ankles. But granted that the rivers do bar our passage, and that guides are not forthcoming, what care we? We need feel no alarm for all that. We have heard of the Mysians, a people whom we certainly cannot admit to be better than ourselves, and yet they inhabit numbers of large and prosperous cities in the king's own country, without asking leave. The Pisidians are an equally good instance, or the Lycaonians. We have seen with our own eyes how they fare, seizing fortresses down in the plains, and reaping the fruits of these men's territory. As to us, I go so far as to assert, we ought never to have let it be seen that we were bent on getting home. At any rate, not so soon. We should have begun stocking and furnishing ourselves, as if we fully meant to settle down for life somewhere or other hereabouts. I am sure that the king would be thrice glad to give the Mysians as many guides as they like, or as many hostages as they care to demand, in return for a safe conduct out of his country. He would make carriage roads for them, and if they preferred to take their departure in coaches and four, he would not say them nay. So too, I am sure, he would be only too glad to accommodate us in the same way, if he saw us preparing to settle down here. But perhaps it is just as well that we did not stop, for I fear, if once we learn to live in idleness and to batten in luxury and dalliance with these tall and handsome Median and Persian women and maidens, we shall be like the lotus eaters, and forget the road home altogether. It seems to me that it is only right, in the first instance, to make an effort to return to Hellas, and to revisit our hearths and homes, if only to prove to other Hellenes that it is their own faults if they are poor and needy, seeing it is in their power to give to those now living a pauper life at home a free passage hither, and convert them into well-to-do burghers at once. Now, sirs, is it not clear that all these good things belong to whoever has strength to hold them? Let us look another matter in the face. How are we to march most safely? Or where blows are needed, how are we to fight to the best advantage? That is the question. The first thing which I recommend is to burn the wagons we have got, so that we may be free to march wherever the army needs, and not, practically, make our baggage train our general. And next, we should throw our tents into the bonfire also, for these again are only a trouble to carry, and do not contribute one grain of good either for fighting or getting provisions. Further, let us get rid of all superfluous baggage, save only what we require for the sake of war or meat and drink, so that as many of us as possible may be under arms, and as few as possible doing porterage. I need not remind you that, in case of defeat, the owner's goods are not their own. But if we master our foes, we will make them our baggage bearers. It only rests for me to name the one thing which I look upon as the greatest of all. You see, the enemy did not dare to bring war to bear upon us until they had first seized our generals. They felt that whilst our rulers were there, and we obeyed them, they were no match for us in war, but having got hold of them, they fully expected that the consequent confusion and anarchy would prove fatal to us. What follows? This: officers and leaders ought to be more vigilant ever than their predecessors, subordinates still more orderly and obedient to those in command now than even they were to those who are gone. And you should pass a resolution that, in case of insubordination, any one who stands by is to aid the officer in chastising the offender. So the enemy will be mightily deceived, for on this day they will behold 10,000 Clearcheses instead of one, who will not suffer one man to play the coward. And now it is high time I brought my remarks to an end, for maybe the enemy will be here anon. Let those who are in favour of these proposals confirm them with all speed, that they may be realized in fact. Or if any other cause seem better, let not any one, even though he be a private soldier, shrink from proposing it. Our common safety is our common need." After this, Chrysippus spoke. He said, "If there is anything else to be done, beyond what Xenophon has mentioned, we shall be able to carry it out presently. But with regard to what he has already proposed, it seems to me the best course to vote upon the matters at once. Those who are in favour of Xenophon's proposals, hold up their hands." They all held them up. Xenophon rose again and said, "Listen, sirs, while I tell you what I think we have need of besides. It is clear that we must march where we can get provisions. Now, I am told, there are some splendid villages not more than 2.5 miles distant. I should not be surprised then if the enemy were to hang on our heels and dog us as we retire, like cowardly curs which rush out at the passer-by and bite him if they can. But when you turn upon them, they run away. Such will be their tactics, I take it. It may be safer then to march in a hollow square, so as to place the baggage animals and our mob of suitlers in greater security. It will save time to make the appointments at once, and to settle who leads the square and directs the vanguard, who will take command of the 2 flanks and who of the rear guard, so that, when the enemy appears, we shall not need to deliberate, but can at once set in motion the machinery in existence. If any one has any better plan, we need not adopt mine. But if not, suppose Chrysippus takes the lead, as he is a Lacedaemonian, and the 2 eldest generals take in charge the 2 wings respectively, while Timasian and I, the 2 youngest, will for the present guard the rear. For the rest, we can but make experiment of this arrangement, and alter it with deliberation, as from time to time any improvement suggests itself. If any one has a better plan to propose, let him do so." No dissentient voice was heard. Accordingly, he said, "Those in favour of this resolution, hold up their hands." The resolution was carried. "And now," said he, "it would be well to separate and carry out what we have decreed. If any of you has set his heart on seeing his friends again, let him remember to prove himself a man. There is no other way to achieve his heart's wish. Or is mere living an object with any of you? Strive to conquer. If to slay is the privilege of victory, to die is the doom of the defeated. Or perhaps to gain money and wealth is your ambition. Strive again for mastery. Have not conquerors the double gain of keeping what is their own, whilst they seize the possessions of the vanquished?" Number 3. The speaking was ended. They got up and retired. Then they burnt the wagons and the tents, and after sharing with one another what each needed out of their various superfluities, they threw the remnant into the fire. Having done that, they proceeded to make their breakfasts. While they were breakfasting, Mithridates came with about 30 horsemen, and summoning the generals within earshot, he thus addressed them: "Men of Hellas, I have been faithful to Cyrus, as you know well, and today I am your well-wisher. Indeed, I am here spending my days in great fear. If then I could see any salutary course in prospect, I should be disposed to join you with all my retainers. Please inform me, then, as to what you propose, regarding me as your friend and well-wisher, anxious only to pursue his march in your company." The generals held council, and resolved to give the following answer, Chrysippus acting as spokesman: "We have resolved to make our way through the country, inflicting the least possible damage, provided we are allowed a free passage homewards, But if any one tries to hinder us, he will have to fight it out with us, and we shall bring all the force in our power to bear." Thereat Mithridates set himself to prove to them that their deliverance, except with the king's good pleasure, was hopeless. Then the meaning of his mission was plain. He was an agent in disguise. In fact, a relation of Tissaphernes was in attendance to keep a check on his loyalty. After that, the generals resolved that it would be better to proclaim open war, without truce or herald, as long as they were in the enemy's country. For they used to come and corrupt the soldiers, and they were even successful with one officer, Nicarchus, an Arcadian, who went off in the night with about 20 men. After this, they breakfasted and crossed the river Zapatas, marching in regular order, with the beasts and mob of the army in the middle. They had not advanced far on their route when Mithridates made his appearance again, with about a couple of 100 horsemen at his back, and bowmen and slingers twice as many, as nimble fellows as a man might hope to see. He approached the Hellenes as if he were friendly, but when they had got fairly to close quarters, all of a sudden some of them, whether mounted or on foot, began shooting with their bows and arrows, and another set with slings, wounding the men. The rearguard of the Hellenes suffered for a while severely without being able to retaliate, for the Cretans had a shorter range than the Persians, and at the same time, being light-armed troops, they lay cooped up within the ranks of the heavy infantry, while the javelin men again did not shoot far enough to reach the enemy's slingers. This being so, Xenophon thought there was nothing for it but to charge, and charge they did, some of the heavy and light infantry who were guarding the rear with him, but for all their charging they did not catch a single man. The dearth of cavalry told against the Hellenes, nor were their infantry able to overhaul the enemy's infantry, with the long start they had, and considering the shortness of the race, for it was out of the question to pursue them far from the main body of the army. On the other hand, the Asiatic cavalry, even while fleeing, poured volleys of arrows behind their backs, and wounded the pursuers, while the Hellenes must fall back fighting every step of the way they had measured in the pursuit, so that by the end of that day they had not gone much more than 3 miles, but in the late afternoon they reached the villages. Here there was a return of the old despondency. Chrysippus and the eldest of the generals blamed Xenophon for leaving the main body to give chase and endangering himself thereby, while he could not damage the enemy 1 whit the more. Xenophon admitted that they were right in blaming him. No better proof of that was wanted than the result. "The fact is," he added, "I was driven to pursue. It was too trying to look on and see our men suffer so badly, and be unable to retaliate. However, when we did charge, there is no denying the truth of what you say. We were not a whit more able to injure the enemy, while we had considerable difficulty in beating a retreat ourselves. Thank heaven they did not come upon us in any great force, but were only a handful of men, so that the injury they did us was not large, as it might have been, and at least it has served to show us what we need. At present, the enemy shoot and sling beyond our range, so that our Cretan archers are no match for them. Our hand-throwers cannot reach as far, and when we pursue, it is not possible to push the pursuit to any great distance from the main body, and within the short distance no foot soldier, however fleet of foot, could overtake another foot soldier who has a bow shot the start of him. If then we are to exclude them from all possibility of injuring us as we march, we must get slingers as soon as possible, and cavalry. I am told there are in the army some Rhodians, most of whom they say know how to sling, and their missile will reach even twice as far as the Persian slings, which on account of their being loaded with stones as big as one's fist have a comparatively short range, but the Rhodians are skilled in the use of leaden bullets. Suppose then we investigate and find out first of all who among them possess slings, and for these slings offer the owner the money value, and to another who will plat some more hand over the money price, and for a third who will volunteer to be enrolled as a slinger invent some other sort of privilege. I think we shall soon find people to come forward capable of helping us. There are horses in the army, I know, some few with myself, others belonging to Clearchus's stud, and a good many others captured from the enemy, used for carrying baggage. Let us take the pick of these, supplying their places by ordinary baggage animals, and equipping the horses for cavalry. I should not wonder if our troopers gave some annoyance to these fugitives." These proposals were carried, and that night 200 slingers were enrolled, and next day as many as 50 horse and horsemen passed muster as duly qualified. Buff jackets and cuirasses were provided for them, and a commandant of cavalry appointed to command, Lycius, the son of Polystratus by name, an Athenian. End of Book 3, Part 2. Book 3, Part 3. Number 4. That day they remained inactive, but the next they rose earlier than usual, and set out betimes, for they had a ravine to cross, where they feared the enemy might attack them in the act of crossing. When they were across, Mithridates appeared again with 1,000 horse, and archers and slingers to the number of 4,000. This whole body he had got by request from Tissaphernes, and in return he undertook to deliver up the Hellenes to Tissaphernes. He had grown contemptuous since his late attack, when with so small a detachment he had done, as he thought, a good deal of mischief, without the slightest loss to himself. When the Hellenes were not only right across, but had got about a mile from the ravine, Mithridates also crossed with his forces. An order had been passed down the lines, what light infantry and what heavy infantry were to take part in the pursuit, and the cavalry were instructed to follow up the pursuit with confidence, as a considerable support was in their rear. So, when Mithridates had come up with them, and they were well within arrow and slingshot, the bugle sounded the signal to the Hellenes, and immediately the detachment under orders rushed to close quarters, and the cavalry charged. There the enemy preferred not to wait, but fled towards the ravine. In this pursuit the Asiatics lost several of their infantry killed, and of their cavalry as many as 18 were taken prisoners in the ravine. As to those who were slain, the Hellenes, acting upon impulse, mutilated their bodies, by way of impressing their enemy with as frightful an image as possible. So fared the foe, and so fell back. But the Hellenes, continuing their march in safety for the rest of that day, reached the river Tigris. Here they came upon a large deserted city, the name of which was Larissa, a place inhabited by the Medes in days of old. The breadth of its walls was 25 feet, and the height of them 100, and the circuit of the whole 2 parasangs. It was built of clay bricks, supported on a stone basis 20 feet high. This city the king of the Persians besieged, what time the Persians strove to snatch their empire from the Medes, but he could in no wise take it. Then a cloud hid the face of the sun, and blotted out the light thereof, until the inhabitants were gone out of the city, and so it was taken. By the side of this city there was a stone pyramid, in breadth 100 feet, and in height 200 feet. In it were many of the barbarians who had fled for refuge from the neighbouring villages. From this place they marched one stage of 6 parasangs to a great deserted fortress, which lay over against the city, and the name of that city was Mespila. The Medes once dwelt in it. The basement was made of polished stone full of shelves. 50 feet was the breadth of it, and 50 feet the height, and on this basement was reared a wall of brick, the breadth whereof was 50 feet, and the height thereof 400, and the circuit of the wall was 6 parasangs. Hither, as the story goes, Medea, the king's wife, betook herself in flight what time the Medes lost their empire at the hands of the Persians. To this city also the king of the Persians laid siege, but could not take it either by length of days or strength of hand. But Zeus sent amazement on the inhabitants thereof, and so it was taken. From this place they marched 1 stage, 4 parasangs. But while still on this stage, Tissaphernes made his appearance. He had with him his own cavalry, and a force belonging to Orontas, who had the king's daughter to wife, and there were, moreover, with them the Asiatics whom Cyrus had taken with him on his march up, together with those whom the king's brother had brought as a reinforcement to the king, besides those whom Tissaphernes himself had received as a gift from the king, so that the armament appeared to be very great. When they were close, he halted some of his regiments at the rear, and wheeled others into position on either flank, but hesitated to attack, having no mind apparently to run any risks, and contenting himself with an order to his slingers to sling, and his archers to shoot. But when the Rhodian slingers and the bowmen, posted at intervals, retaliated, and every shot told, for, with the utmost pains to miss, it would have been hard to do so under the circumstances, then Tissaphernes with all speed retired out of range, the other regiments following suit, and for the rest of the day the one party advanced and the other followed. But now the Asiatics had ceased to be dangerous with their sharpshooting, for the Rhodians could reach further than the Persian slingers, or indeed than most of the bowmen. The Persian bows are of great size, so that the Cretans found the arrows which were picked up serviceable, and persevered in using their enemies' arrows, and practised shooting with them, letting them fly upwards to a great height. There were also plenty of bowstrings found in the villages, and lead, which they turned to account for their slings. As a result of this day, then, the Hellenes chancing upon some villages had no sooner encamped than the barbarians fell back, having had distinctly the worst of it in the skirmishing. The next day was a day of inaction. They halted and took in supplies, as there was much corn in the villages. But on the day following, the march was continued through the plain of the Tigris, and Tissaphernes still hung on their skirts with his skirmishers. And now it was that the Hellenes discovered the defect of marching in a square with an enemy following. As a matter of necessity, whenever the wings of an army so disposed draw together, either where a road narrows or hills close in, or a bridge has to be crossed, the heavy infantry cannot help being squeezed out of their ranks, and march with difficulty, partly from actual pressure, and partly from the general confusion that ensues. Or, supposing the wings are again extended, the troops have hardly recovered from their former distress before they are pulled asunder, and there is a wide space between the wings, and the men concerned lose confidence in themselves, especially with an enemy close behind. What happened, when a bridge had to be crossed or other passage effected, was, that each unit of the force pressed on in anxiety to get over first, and at these moments it was easy for the enemy to make an attack. The generals accordingly, having recognized the defect, set about curing it. To do so, they made 6 lochi, or divisions of 100 men apiece, each of which had its own set of captains and under-officers in command of half and quarter companies. It was the duty of these new companies, during a march, whenever the flanks needed to close in, to fall back to the rear, so as to disencumber the wings. This they did by wheeling clear of them. When the sides of the oblong again extended, they filled up the interstices, if the gap were narrow, by columns of companies, if broader, by columns of half companies, or, if broader still, by columns of quarter companies, so that the space between was always filled up. If again it were necessary to effect a passage by bridge or otherwise, there was no confusion, the several companies crossing in turns, or, if the occasion arose to form in line of battle, these companies came up to the front and fell in. In this way they advanced 4 stages, but ere the 5th was completed, they came in sight of a palace of some sort, with villages clustered round it. They could further see that the road leading to this place pursued its course over high undulating hillocks, the spur of the mountain range, under which lay the village. These knolls were a welcome sight to the Hellenes, naturally enough, as the enemy were cavalry. However, when they had issued from the plain and ascended the first crest, and were in the act of descending it so as to mount the next, at this juncture the barbarians came upon them. From the high ground down the sheer steep they poured a volley of darts, slingstones, and arrows, which they discharged under the lash, wounding many, until they got the better of the Hellenic light troops, and drove them for shelter behind the heavy infantry, so that this day that arm was altogether useless, huddling in the mob of sutlers, both slingers and archers alike. But when the Hellenes, being so pressed, made an attempt to pursue, they could barely scale to the summit, being heavy-armed troops, while the enemy as lightly sprung away, and they suffered similarly in retiring to join the rest of the army. And then, on the second hill, the whole had to be gone through again, so that when it came to the third hillock, they determined not to move the main body of troops from their position until they had brought up a squadron of light infantry from the right flank of the square to a point on the mountain range. When this detachment were once posted above their pursuers, the latter desisted from attacking the main body in its descent, for fear of being cut off and finding themselves between 2 assailants. Thus the rest of the day they moved on in 2 divisions, one set keeping to the road by the hillocks, the other marching parallel on the higher level along the mountains, and thus they reached the villages and appointed 8 surgeons to attend to the many wounded. Here they halted 3 days for the sake of the wounded chiefly, while a further inducement was the plentiful supply of provisions which they found, wheat and wine, and large stores of barley laid up for horses. These supplies had been collected by the ruling satrap of the country. On the 4th day they began their descent into the plain, but when Tissaphernes overtook them, necessity taught them to camp in the first village they caught sight of, and give over the attempt of marching and fighting simultaneously, as so many were hors de combat, being either on the list of wounded themselves, or else engaged in carrying the wounded, or laden with the heavy arms of those so occupied. But when they were once encamped, and the barbarians, advancing upon the village, made an attempt to harass them with their sharp shooters, the superiority of the Hellenes was pronounced. To sustain a running fight with an enemy constantly attacking was one thing, to keep him at arm's length from a fixed base of action another, and the difference was much in their favour. But when it was late afternoon, the time had come for the enemy to withdraw, since the habit of the barbarian was never to encamp within 7 or 8 miles of the Hellenic camp. This he did in apprehension of a night attack, for a Persian army is good for nothing at night. Their horses are haltered, and, as a rule, hobbled as well, to prevent their escaping, as they might if loose, so that, if any alarm occurs, the trooper has to saddle and bridle his horse, and then he must put on his own cuirass, and then mount, all which performances are difficult at night and in the midst of confusion. For this reason they always encamped at a distance from the Hellenes. When the Hellenes perceived that they were preparing to retire, and that the order was being given, the herald's cry, "Pack up for starting!" might be heard before the enemy was fairly out of earshot. For a while the Asiatics paused, as if unwilling to be gone, but as night closed in, off they went, for it did not suit their notions of expediency to set off on a march and arrive by night. And now, when the Hellenes saw that they were really and clearly gone, they too broke up their camp, and pursued their march till they had traversed 7½ miles. Thus the distance between the two armies grew to be so great that the next day the enemy did not appear at all, nor yet on the third day. But on the fourth the barbarians had pushed on by a forced night march and occupied a commanding position on the right, where the Hellenes had to pass. It was a narrow mountain spur overhanging the descent into the plain. But when Chrysippus saw that this ridge was occupied, he summoned Xenophon from the rear, bidding him at the same time to bring up peltasts to the front. That Xenophon hesitated to do, for Tissaphernes and his whole army were coming up and were well within sight. Galloping up to the front himself, he asked, "Why do you summon me?" The other answered him, "The reason is plain. Look yonder, this crest which overhangs our descent has been occupied. There is no passing until we have dislodged these fellows. Why have you not brought up the light infantry?" Xenophon explained. He had not thought it desirable to leave the rear unprotected with an enemy appearing in the field of view. "However, it is time," he added, "to decide how we are to dislodge these fellows from the crest." At this moment his eye fell on the peak of the mountain, rising immediately above their army, and he could see an approach leading from it to the crest in question where the enemy lay. He exclaimed, "The best thing we can do, Chrysippus, is to make a dash at the height itself, and with what speed we may. If we take it, the party in command of the road will never be able to stop. If you like, stay in command of the army and I will go, or if you prefer, do you go to the mountain and I will stay here." "I leave it to you," Chrysippus answered, "to choose which you like best." Xenophon remarking, "I am the younger," elected to go, but he stipulated for a detachment from the front to accompany him, since it was a long way to fetch up troops from the rear. Accordingly Chrysippus furnished him with the light infantry from the front, reoccupying their place by those from the centre. He also gave him to form part of the detachment, the 300 of the picked corps under his own command at the head of the square. They set out from the low ground with all the haste imaginable, but the enemy in position on the crest no sooner perceived their advance upon the summit of the pass than they themselves set off full tilt in a rival race for the summit too. Hoarse were the shouts of the Hellenic troops as the men cheered their companions forwards, and hoarse the answering shouts from the troops of Tissaphernes urging on theirs. Xenophon, mounted on his charger, rode beside his men, and roused their ardour the while. "Now for it, brave sirs! Bethink you that this race is for Hellas, now or never, to find your boys, your wives. One small effort, and the rest of the march we shall pursue in peace, without ever a blow to strike. Now for it!" But Socrates the Sicyonian said, "We are not on equal terms, Xenophon. You are mounted on a horse, I can hardly get along with my shield to carry." And he, on hearing the reproach, leapt from his horse. In another instant he had pushed Socrates from the ranks, snatched from him his shield, and begun marching as quickly as he might under the circumstances, having his horseman's cuirass to carry as well, so that he was sore pressed. But he continued to cheer on the troops, exhorting those in front to lead on and the men toiling behind to follow up. Socrates was not spared by the rest of the men. They gave him blows, they pelted him, they showered him with abuse, till they compelled him to take back his shield and march on, and the other, remounting, led them on horseback as long as the footing held. But when the ground became too steep, he left his horse and pressed forward on foot, and so they found themselves on the summit, before the enemy. 5. There and then the barbarians turned and fled as best they might, and the Hellenes held the summit, while the troops with Tissaphernes and Ariaeus turned aside and disappeared by another road. The main body with Chrysippus made its way down into the plain, and encamped in a village filled with good things of divers sorts. Nor did this village stand alone. There were others not a few in this plain of the Tigris, equally overflowing with plenty. It was now afternoon, and all of a sudden the enemy came in sight on the plain, and succeeded in cutting down some of the Hellenes belonging to parties who were scattered over the flat land in quest of spoil. Indeed, many herds of cattle had been caught whilst being conveyed across to the other side of the river. And now Tissaphernes and his troops made an attempt to burn the villages, and some of the Hellenes were disposed to take the matter deeply to heart, being apprehensive that they might not know where to get provisions if the enemy burnt the villages. Chrysippus and his men were returning from their sally of defence when Xenophon and his party descended, and the latter rode along the ranks as the rescuing party came up, and greeted them thus: "Do you not see, men of Hellas, they admit that the country is now ours, what they stipulated against our doing when they made the treaty, viz. That we were not to fire the king's country, they are now themselves doing, setting fire to it as if it were not their own. But we will be even with them. If they leave provisions for themselves anywhere, there also shall they see us marching." And turning to Chrysippus, he added: "But it strikes me, we should sally forth against these incendiaries, and protect our country." Chrysippus retorted: "That is not quite my view. I say let us do a little burning ourselves, and they will cease all the quicker." When they had got back to the villages, while the rest were busy about provisions, the generals and officers met, and here there was deep despondency, for on the one side were exceedingly high mountains, on the other a river of such depth that they failed to reach the bottom with their spears. In the midst of their perplexities, a Rhodian came up with a proposal as follows: "I am ready, sirs, to carry you across 4,000 heavy infantry at a time, if you will furnish me with what I need, and give me a talent into the bargain for my pains." When asked, "What shall you need?" he replied, 2,000 wineskins. I see there are plenty of sheep and goats and asses. They have only to be flayed and their skins inflated, and they will readily give us a passage. I shall want also the straps which you use for the baggage animals. With these I shall couple the skins to one another. Then I shall moor each skin by attaching stones and letting them down like anchors into the water. Then I shall carry them across, and when I have fastened the links at both ends, I shall place layers of wood on them, and a coating of earth on the top of that. You will see in a minute that there's no danger of your drowning, for every skin will be able to support a couple of men without sinking, and the wood and earth will prevent your slipping off." The generals thought it a pretty invention enough, but its realization impracticable, for on the other side were masses of cavalry posted and ready to bar the passage, who, to begin with, would not suffer the first detachment of crossers to carry out any item of the programme. Under these circumstances, the next day they turned right about face and began retracing their steps in the direction of Babylon, to the unburnt villages, having previously set fire to those they left, so that the enemy did not ride up to them, but stood and stared, all agape to see in what direction the Hellenes would betake themselves, and what they were minded to do. Here again, while the rest of the soldiers were busy about provisions, the generals and officers met in council, and after collecting the prisoners together, submitted them to a cross-examination touching the whole country round, the names and so forth of each district. The prisoners informed them that the region south, through which they had come, belonged to the district towards Babylon and Media. The road east led to Susa and Ecbatana, where the king is said to spend summer and spring. Crossing the river, the road west led to Lydia and Ionia, and the part through the mountains facing towards the Great Bear led, they said, to the Carduchians. They were a people, so said the prisoners, dwelling up on the hills, addicted to war, and not subject to the king; so much so that once, when a royal army 120,000 strong had invaded them, not a man came back, owing to the intricacies of the country. Occasionally, however, they made truce or treaty with the satrap in the plain, and, for the nonce, there would be intercourse. "They will come in and out amongst us, and we will go in and out amongst them," said the captives. After hearing these statements, the generals seated apart those who claimed to have any special knowledge of the country in any direction. They put them to sit apart without making it clear which particular route they intended to take. Finally, the resolution to which they came was that they must force a passage through the hills into the territory of the Kurds, since, according to what their informants told them, when they had once passed these, they would find themselves in Armenia, the rich and large territory governed by Orontas, and from Armenia it would be easy to proceed in any direction whatever. Thereupon they offered sacrifice, so as to be ready to start on the march as soon as the right moment appeared to have arrived. Their chief fear was that the high pass over the mountains must be occupied in advance, and a general order was issued that after supper everyone should get his kit together for starting, and repose, in readiness to follow as soon as the word of command was given. End of Book 3. Book 4, Part 1. Number 1. It was now about the last watch, and enough of the night remained to allow them to cross the valley under cover of darkness, when, at the word of command, they rose and set off on their march, reaching the mountains at daybreak. At this stage of the march, Chrysippus, at the head of his own division, with the whole of the light troops, led the van, while Xenophon followed behind with the heavy infantry of the rearguard, but without any light troops, since there seemed to be no danger of pursuit or attack from the rear, while they were making their way uphill. Chrysippus reached the summit without any of the enemy perceiving him. Then he led on slowly, and the rest of the army followed, wave upon wave, cresting the summit and descending into the villages which nestled in the hollows and recesses of the hills. Thereupon the Carduchians abandoned their dwelling places, and with their wives and children fled to the mountains, so there was plenty of provisions to be got for the mere trouble of taking, and the homesteads too were well supplied with the copious store of bronze vessels and utensils which the Hellenes kept their hands off, abstaining at the same time from all pursuit of the folk themselves, gently handling them, in hopes that the Carduchians might be willing to give them friendly passage through their country, since they too were enemies of the king. Only they helped themselves to such provisions as fell in their way, which indeed was a sheer necessity. But the Carduchians neither gave ear when they called to them, nor showed any other friendly sign. And now, as the last of the Hellenes descended into the villages from the pass, they were already in the dark, since, owing to the narrowness of the road, the whole day had been spent in the ascent and descent. At that instant a party of the Carduchians, who had collected, made an attack on the hindmost men, killing some and wounding others with stones and arrows, though it was quite a small body who attacked. The fact was, the approach of the Hellenic army had taken them by surprise. If, however, they had mustered in larger force at this time, the chances are that a large portion of the army would have been annihilated. As it was, they got into quarters and bivouacked in the villages that night, while the Carduchians kept many watch-fires blazing in a circle on the mountains, and kept each other in sight all round. But with the dawn, the generals and officers of the Hellenes met and resolved to proceed, taking only the necessary number of stout baggage animals, and leaving the weaklings behind. They resolved further to let go free all the lately captured slaves in the host, for the pace of the march was necessarily rendered slow by the quantity of animals and prisoners, and the number of non-combatants in attendance on these was excessive, while, with such a crowd of human beings to satisfy, twice the amount of provisions had to be procured and carried. These resolutions passed, they caused a proclamation by herald to be made for their enforcement. When they had breakfasted and the march recommenced, the generals planted themselves a little to one side in a narrow place, and when they found any of the aforesaid slaves or other property still retained, they confiscated them. The soldiers yielded obedience, except where some smuggler, prompted by desire of a good-looking boy or woman, managed to make off with his prize. During this day they contrived to get along after a fashion, now fighting and now resting. But on the next day they were visited by a great storm, in spite of which they were obliged to continue the march, owing to insufficiency of provisions. Chrysippus was as usual leading in front, while Xenophon headed the rear guard, when the enemy began a violent and sustained attack. At one narrow place after another they came up quite close, pouring in volleys of arrows and sling stones, so that the Hellenes had no choice but to make sallies in pursuit and then again recoil, making but very little progress. Over and over again Xenophon would send an order to the front to slacken pace, when the enemy were pressing their attack severely. As a rule, when the word was so passed up, Chrysippus slackened. But sometimes, instead of slackening, Chrysippus quickened, sending down a counter-order to the rear to follow on quickly. It was clear that there was something or other happening, but there was no time to go to the front and discover the cause of the hurry. Under the circumstances, the march, at any rate in the rear, became very like a rout, and here a brave man lost his life, Cleonymus the Laconian, shot with an arrow in the ribs right through shield and corselet, as also Basius, an Arcadian, shot clean through the head. As soon as they reached a halting place, Xenophon, without more ado, came up to Chrysippus and took him to task for not having waited, "whereby," he said, "we were forced to fight and flee at the same moment, and now it has cost us the lives of two fine fellows. They are dead, and we were not able to pick up their bodies or bury them." Chrysippus answered, "Look up there," pointing as he spoke to the mountain. "Do you see how inaccessible it all is? Only this one road, which you see, going straight up, and on it all that crowd of men who have seized and are guarding the single exit. That is why I hastened on, and why I could not wait for you, hoping to be beforehand with them yonder in seizing the pass. The guides we have got say there is no other way." And Xenophon replied, "But I have got 2 prisoners also. The enemy annoyed us so much that we laid an ambuscade for them, which also gave us time to recover our breaths. We killed some of them, and did our best to catch 1 or 2 alive, for this very reason, that we might have guides who knew the country to depend upon." The 2 were brought up at once, and questioned separately. Did they know of any other road than the one visible? The first said no, and in spite of all sorts of terrors applied to extract a better answer, "No," he persisted. When nothing could be got out of him, he was killed before the eyes of his fellow. This latter then explained, "Yonder man said he did not know, because he has got a daughter married to a husband in those parts. I can take you," he added, "by a good road, practicable even for beasts." And when asked whether there was any point on it difficult to pass, he replied that there was a col which it would be impossible to pass unless it were occupied in advance. Then it was resolved to summon the officers of the light infantry, and some of those of the heavy infantry, and to acquaint them with the state of affairs, and ask them whether any of them were minded to distinguish themselves, and would step forward as volunteers on an expedition. 2 or 3 heavy infantry soldiers stepped forward at once, 2 Arcadians, Aristonymus of Methydrium and Agasius of Stymphalus, and in emulation of these, a 3rd, also an Arcadian, Callimachus from Parasia, who said he was ready to go, and would get volunteers from the whole army to join him. "I know," he added, "there will be no lack of youngsters to follow where I lead." After that they asked, were there any captains of light infantry willing to accompany the expedition? Aristeus, a Chian, who on several occasions proved his usefulness to the army on such service, volunteered. Number 2. It was already late afternoon when they ordered the storming party to take a snatch of food and set off. Then they bound the guide and handed him over to them. The agreement was, that if they succeeded in taking the summit, they were to guard the position that night, and at daybreak to give a signal by bugle. At this signal the party on the summit were to attack the enemy in occupation of the visible pass, while the generals with the main body would bring up their succours, making their way up with what speed they might. With this understanding off they set, 2,000 strong, and there was a heavy downpour of rain, but Xenophon, with his rear guard, began advancing to the visible pass, so that the enemy might fix his attention on this road, and the party creeping round might, as much as possible, elude observation. Now when the rear guard, so advancing, had reached a ravine which they must cross in order to strike up the steep, at that instant the barbarians began rolling down great boulders, each a wagon load, some larger, some smaller. Against the rocks they crashed and splintered, flying like sling stones in every direction, so that it was absolutely out of the question even to approach the entrance of the pass. Some of the officers, finding themselves balked at this point, kept trying other ways, nor did they desist till darkness set in, and then, when they thought they would not be seen retiring, they returned to supper. Some of them who had been on duty in the rearguard had had no breakfast, it so happened. However, the enemy never ceased rolling down their stones all through the night, as was easy to infer from the booming sound. The party with the guide made a circuit and surprised the enemy's guards seated round their fire, and after killing some, and driving out the rest, took their places, thinking that they were in possession of the height. As a matter of fact, they were not, for above them lay a breast-like hill, skirted by the narrow road on which they had found the guards seated. Still, from the spot in question there was an approach to the enemy, who were seated on the pass before mentioned. Here then they passed the night, but at the first glimpse of dawn they marched stealthily and in battle order against the enemy. There was a mist, so that they could get quite close without being observed. But as soon as they caught sight of one another, the trumpet sounded, and with a loud cheer they rushed upon the fellows, who did not wait their coming, but left the road and made off, with the loss of only a few lives, however, so nimble were they. Cheirisophus and his men, catching the sound of the bugle, charged up by the well-marked road, while others of the generals pushed their way up by pathless routes, where each division chanced to be, the men mounting as they were best able, and hoisting one another up by means of their spears, and these were the first to unite with the party who had already taken the position by storm. Xenophon, with the rear guard, followed the path which the party with the guide had taken, since it was easiest for the beasts of burthen. One half of his men he had posted in rear of the baggage animals, the other half he had with himself. In their course they encountered a crest above the road, occupied by the enemy, whom they must either dislodge or be themselves cut off from the rest of the Hellenes. The men by themselves could have taken the same route as the rest, but the baggage animals could not mount by any other way than this. Here then, with shouts of encouragement to each other, they dashed at the hill with their storming columns, not from all sides, but leaving an avenue of escape for the enemy, if he chose to avail himself of it. For a while, as the men scrambled up where each best could, the natives kept up a fire of arrows and darts, yet did not receive them at close quarters, but presently left the position in flight. No sooner, however, were the Hellenes safely past this crest, than they came in sight of another in front of them, also occupied, and deemed it advisable to storm it also. But now it struck Xenophon that if they left the ridge just taken unprotected in their rear, the enemy might reoccupy it, and attack the baggage animals as they filed past, presenting a long extended line owing to the narrowness of the road by which they made their way. To obviate this, he left some officers in charge of the ridge: Cephisodorus, son of Cephisophon, an Athenian, Amphicrates, the son of Amphidamas, an Athenian, and Archagoras, an Argive exile, while he in person with the rest of the men attacked the second ridge. This they took in the same fashion, only to find that they had still a third knoll left, far the steepest of the three. This was none other than the Mamelon mentioned as above the outpost, which had been captured over their fire by the volunteer storming party in the night. But when the Hellenes were close, the natives, to the astonishment of all, without a struggle deserted the knoll. It was conjectured that they had left their position from fear of being encircled and besieged, but the fact was that they, from their higher ground, had been able to see what was going on in the rear, and had all made off in this fashion to attack the rear guard. So then Xenophon, with the youngest men, scaled up to the top, leaving orders to the rest to march on slowly, so as to allow the hindmost companies to unite with them, They were to advance by the road, and when they reached the level, to ground arms. Meanwhile, the Argive Archagorus arrived, in full flight, with the announcement that they had been dislodged from the first ridge, and that Cephisodoros and Amphicrates were slain, with a number of others besides, all in fact who had not jumped down the crags and so reached the rearguard. After this achievement, the barbarians came to a crest facing the Mamelon, and Xenophon held a colloquy with them by means of an interpreter to negotiate a truce, and demanded back the dead bodies. These they agreed to restore if he would not burn their houses, and to these terms Xenophon agreed. Meanwhile, as the rest of the army filed past, and the colloquy was proceeding, all the people of the place had time to gather gradually, and the enemy formed. And as soon as the Hellenes began to descend from the Mamelon to join the others where the troops were halted, on rushed the foe, in full force, with hue and cry. They reached the summit of the Mamelon from which Xenophon was descending, and began rolling down crags. One man's leg was crushed to pieces. Xenophon was left by his shield-bearer, who carried off his shield, but Eurylochus of Lucia, an Arcadian hoplite, ran up to him, and threw his shield in front to protect both of them. So the two together beat a retreat, and so too the rest, and joined the serried ranks of the main body. After this, the whole Hellenic force united, and took up their quarters there in numerous beautiful dwellings, with an ample store of provisions; for there was wine so plentiful that they had it in cemented cisterns. Xenophon and Chrysippus arranged to recover the dead, and in return restored the guide. Afterwards they did everything for the dead, according to the means at their disposal, with the customary honours paid to good men. Next day they set off without a guide, and the enemy, by keeping up a continuous battle, and occupying in advance every narrow place, obstructed passage after passage. Accordingly, whenever the van was obstructed, Xenophon, from behind, made a dash up the hills and broke the barricade, and freed the vanguard by endeavouring to get above the obstructing enemy. Whenever the rear was the point attacked, Chrysippus in the same way made a detour, and by endeavouring to mount higher than the barricaders, freed the passage for the rear rank. And in this way, turn and turn about, they rescued each other, and paid unflinching attention to their mutual needs. At times it happened that, the relief party having mounted, encountered considerable annoyance in their descent from the barbarians, who were so agile that they allowed them to come up quite close before they turned back and still escaped, partly no doubt because the only weapons they had to carry were bows and slings. They were, moreover, excellent archers, using bows nearly 3 cubits long and arrows more than 2 cubits. When discharging the arrow, they draw the string by getting a purchase with the left foot planted forward on the lower end of the bow. The arrows pierce through shield and cuirass, and the Hellenes, when they got hold of them, used them as javelins, fitting them to their thongs. In these districts the Cretans were highly serviceable. They were under the command of Stratocles, a Cretan. When the generals heard this news, they resolved to collect the troops, and they set off at once, taking the prisoner to act as guide, and leaving a garrison behind with Sophonitus the Stymphalian in command of those who remained in the camp. As soon as they had begun to cross the hills, the light infantry, advancing in front and catching sight of the camp, did not wait for the heavy infantry, but with a loud shout rushed upon the enemy's entrenchment. The natives, hearing the din and clatter, did not care to stop, but took rapidly to their heels. But, for all their expedition, some of them were killed, and as many as 20 horses were captured, with the tent of Anabasis and its contents, silver-footed couches and goblets, besides certain persons styling themselves the butlers and bakers. As soon as the generals of the heavy infantry division had learnt the news, they resolved to return to the camp with all speed, for fear of an attack being made on the remnant left behind. The recall was sounded, and the retreat commenced. The camp was reached the same day. End of Book 4, Part 1. Book 4, Part 2, Number 3. During this day they bivouacked in the villages which lie above the plain of the river Contrites, which is about 200 feet broad. It is the frontier river between Armenia and the country of the Carduchians. Here the Hellenes recruited themselves, and the sight of the plain filled them with joy, for the river was but 6 or 7 furlongs distant from the mountains of the Carduchians. For the moment, then, they bivouacked right happily. They had their provisions. They had also many memories of the labours that were now past, seeing that the last 7 days spent in traversing the country of the Carduchians had been one long continuous battle, which had cost them more suffering than the whole of their troubles at the hands of the king and Tissaphernes put together. As though they were truly quit of them for ever, they laid their heads to rest in sweet content. But with the morrow's dawn they espied horsemen at a certain point across the river, armed cap a pie, as if they meant to dispute the passage. Infantry too, drawn up in line upon the banks above the cavalry, threatened to prevent them debouching into Armenia. These troops were Armenian and Mardian and Chaldean mercenaries belonging to Orontas and Artuchas. The last of the three, the Chaldeans, were said to be a free and brave set of people. They were armed with long wicker shields and lances. The banks before named on which they were drawn up were 100 yards or more distant from the river, and the single road which was visible was one leading upwards and looking like a regular artificially constructed highway. At this point the Hellenes endeavoured to cross, but on their making the attempt the water proved to be more than breast deep, and the river bed was rough with great slippery stones, and as to holding their arms in the water, it was out of the question. The stream swept them away, or if they tried to carry them over the head, the body was left exposed to the arrows and other missiles. Accordingly, they turned back and encamped there by the bank of the river. At the point where they had themselves been last night, up on the mountains, they could see the Carduchians collected in large numbers and under arms. A shadow of deep despair again descended on their souls, whichever way they turned their eyes. In front lay the river so difficult to ford, over on the other side a new enemy threatening to bar the passage, on the hills behind the Carduchians ready to fall upon their rear should they once again attempt to cross. Thus for this day and night they halted, sunk in perplexity. But Xenophon had a dream. In his sleep he thought that he was bound in fetters, but these, of their own accord, fell from off him, so that he was loosed and could stretch his legs as freely as he wished. So, at the first glimpse of daylight, he came to Chrysippus and told him that he had hopes that all things would go well, and related to him his dream. The other was well pleased, and with the first faint gleam of dawn the generals all were present and did sacrifice, and the victims were favourable in the first essay. Retiring from the sacrifice, the generals and officers issued an order to the troops to take their breakfasts, and while Xenophon was taking his, 2 young men came running up to him, for everyone knew that, breakfasting or supping, he was always accessible, or that even if asleep anyone was welcome to awaken him who had anything to say bearing on the business of war. What the 2 young men had at this time to say was that they had been collecting brushwood for fire, and had presently espied on the opposite side, in among some rocks which came down to the river's brink, an old man and some women and little girls depositing, as it would appear, bags of clothes in a cavernous rock. When they saw them, it struck them that it was safe to cross. In any case, the enemy's cavalry could not approach at this point. So they stripped naked, expecting to have to swim for it, and with their long knives in their hands began crossing, but going forward crossed without being wet up to the fork. Once across, they captured the clothes and came back again. Accordingly, Xenophon at once poured out a libation himself, and bade the 2 young fellows fill the cup and pray to the gods, who showed to him this vision and to them a passage, to bring all other blessings for them to accomplishment. When he had poured out the libation, he at once led the 2 young men to Chrysippus, and they repeated to him their story. Chrysippus, on hearing it, offered libations also, and when they had performed them, they sent a general order to the troops to pack up ready for starting, while they themselves called a meeting of the generals, and took counsel how they might best effect a passage, so as to overpower the enemy in front without suffering any loss from the men behind. And they resolved that Chrysippus should lead the van and cross with half the army, the other half still remaining behind under Xenophon, while the baggage animals and the mob of sutlers were to cross between the two divisions. When all was duly ordered, the move began, the young men pioneering them, and keeping the river on their left. It was about 4 furlongs' march to the crossing, and as they moved along the bank, the squadrons of cavalry kept pace with them on the opposite side. But when they had reached a point in a line with the ford, and the cliff-like banks of the river, they grounded arms, and first Chrysippus himself placed a wreath upon his brows, and throwing off his cloak, resumed his arms, passing the order to all the rest to do the same, and bade the captains form their companies in open order in deep columns, some to left and some to right of himself. Meanwhile the soothsayers were slaying a victim over the river, and the enemy were letting fly their arrows and sling-stones, but as yet they were out of range. As soon as the victims were favourable, all the soldiers began singing the battle hymn, and with the notes of the paean mingled the shouting of the men, accompanied by the shriller chant of the women, for there were many women in the camp. So Chrysippus with his detachment stepped in, but Xenophon, taking the most active body of the rear guard, began running back at full speed to the passage facing the egress into the hills of Armenia, making a feint of crossing at that point to intercept their cavalry on the river bank. The enemy, seeing Chrysippus's detachment easily crossing the stream, and Xenophon's men racing back, were seized with the fear of being intercepted, and fled at full speed in the direction of the road which emerges from the stream. But when they were come opposite to it, they raced uphill towards their mountains. Then Lycias, who commanded the cavalry, and Aeschines, who was in command of the division of light infantry attached to Chrysippus, no sooner saw them fleeing so lustily than they were after them, and the soldiers shouted not to fall behind, but to follow them right up to the mountains. Chrysippus, on getting across, forbore to pursue the cavalry, but advanced by the bluffs which reached to the river, to attack the enemy overhead, and these, seeing their own cavalry fleeing, seeing also the heavy infantry advancing upon them, abandoned the heights above the river. Xenophon, as soon as he saw that things were going well on the other side, fell back with all speed to join the troops engaged in crossing, for by this time the Carduchians were well in sight, descending into the plain to attack their rear. Chrysippus was in possession of the higher ground, and Lycias, with his little squadron, in an attempt to follow up the pursuit, had captured some stragglers of their baggage-bearers, and with them some handsome apparel and drinking cups. The baggage animals of the Hellenes and the mob of non-combatants were just about to cross, when Xenophon turned his troops right about to face the Carduchians. Vis-à-vis he formed his line, passing the order to the captains each to form his company into sections, and to deploy them into line by the left, the captains of companies and lieutenants in command of sections to advance to meet the Carduchians, while the rear leaders would keep their position facing the river. But when the Carduchians saw the rearguard so stripped of the mass, and looking now like a mere handful of men, they advanced all the more quickly, singing certain songs the while. Then, as matters were safe with him, Chrysippus sent back the peltasts and slingers and archers to join Xenophon, with orders to carry out his instructions. They were in the act of recrossing, when Xenophon, who saw their intention, sent a messenger across, bidding them wait there at the river's brink without crossing. But as soon as he and his detachment began to cross, they were to step in facing him in 2 flanking divisions, right and left of them, as if in the act of crossing, the javelin men with their javelins on the thong, and the bowmen with their arrows on the string, but they were not to advance far into the stream. The order passed to his own men was, "Wait till you are within slingshot, and the shield rattles, then sound the paean, and charge the enemy. As soon as he turns and the bugle from the river sounds for the attack, you will face about to the right, the rear rank leading, and the whole detachment falling back and crossing the river as quickly as possible, everyone preserving his original rank, so as to avoid trammeling one another. The bravest man is he who gets to the other side first." The Carduchians, seeing that the remnant left was the merest handful, for many even of those whose duty it was to remain had gone off in their anxiety to protect their beasts of burden, or their personal kit, or their mistresses, bore down upon them valorously, and opened fire with sling-stones and arrows. But the Hellenes, raising the battle hymn, dashed at them at a run, and they did not await them, armed well enough for mountain warfare, and with a view to sudden attack followed by speedy flight. They were not by any means sufficiently equipped for an engagement at close quarters. At this instant the signal of the bugle was heard. Its notes added wings to the flight of the barbarians, but the Hellenes turned right about in the opposite direction, and betook themselves to the river with what speed they might. Some of the enemy, here a man and there another, perceived, and running back to the river, let fly their arrows and wounded a few, but the majority, even when the Hellenes were well across, were still to be seen pursuing their flight. The detachment which came to meet Xenophon's men, carried away by their valour, advanced further than they had need to, and had to cross back again in the rear of Xenophon's men, and of these too a few were wounded. 4. The passage effected, they fell into line about midday, and marched through Armenian territory, one long plain with smooth rolling hillocks, not less than 5 parasangs in distance, for owing to the wars of this people with the Carduchians, there were no villages near the river. The village eventually reached was large, and possessed a palace belonging to the satrap, and most of the houses were crowned with turrets. Provisions were plentiful. From this village they marched 2 stages, 10 parasangs, until they had surmounted the sources of the river Tigris, and from this point they marched 3 stages, 15 parasangs, to the river Teleboes. This was a fine stream, though not large, and there were many villages about it. The district was named Western Armenia. The lieutenant governor of it was Anabasis, the king's friend, and whenever the latter paid a visit, he alone had the privilege of mounting the king upon his horse. This officer rode up to the Hellenes with a body of cavalry, and sending forward an interpreter, stated that he desired a colloquy with the leaders. The generals resolved to hear what he had to say, and advancing on their side to within speaking distance, they demanded what he wanted. He replied that he wished to make a treaty with them, in accordance with which he on his side would abstain from injuring the Hellenes, if they would not burn his houses, but merely take such provisions as they needed. This proposal satisfied the generals, and a treaty was made on the terms suggested. From this place they marched 3 stages, 15 parasangs, through plain country, Anabasis the while keeping close behind with his own forces more than a mile off. Presently they reached a palace with villages clustered round about it, which were full of supplies in great variety. But while they were encamping in the night, there was a heavy fall of snow, and in the morning it was resolved to billet out the different regiments, with their generals, throughout the villages. There was no enemy in sight, and the proceeding seemed prudent, owing to the quantity of snow. In these quarters they had for provisions all the good things there are: sacrificial beasts, corn, old wines with an exquisite bouquet, dried grapes, and vegetables of all sorts. But some of the stragglers from the camp reported having seen an army, and the blaze of many watch-fires in the night. Accordingly, the generals concluded that it was not prudent to separate their quarters in this way, and a resolution was passed to bring the troops together again. After that they reunited, the more so that the weather promised to be fine with a clear sky. But while they lay there in open quarters, during the night down came so thick a fall of snow that it completely covered up the stacks of arms and the men themselves lying down. It cramped and crippled the baggage animals, and there was great unreadiness to get up, so gently fell the snow as they lay there warm and comfortable and formed a blanket, except where it slipped off the sleepers' shoulders, and it was not until Xenophon roused himself to get up and, without his cloak on, began to split wood, that quickly first one and then another got up, and taking the log away from him, fell to splitting. Thereat the rest followed suit, got up and began kindling fire and oiling their bodies, for there was a scented unguent to be found there in abundance, which they used instead of oil. It was made from pig's fat, sesame, bitter almonds, and turpentine. There was a sweet oil also to be found, made of the same ingredients. After this, it was resolved that they must again separate their quarters and get under cover in the villages. At this news, the soldiers, with much joy and shouting, rushed upon the covered houses and the provisions; but all who in their blind folly had set fire to their houses when they left them before, now paid the penalty in the poor quarters they got. From this place, one night they sent off a party under Democritus, a Temenite, up into the mountains where the stragglers reported having seen watchfires. The leader selected was a man whose judgment might be depended upon to verify the truth of the matter. With a happy gift to distinguish between fact and fiction, he had often been successfully appealed to. He went and reported that he had seen no watchfires, but he had got a man, whom he brought back with him, carrying a Persian bow and quiver, and a cigaris or battle-axe like those worn by the Amazons. When asked from what country he came, the prisoner answered that he was a Persian, and was going from the army of Anabasis to get provisions. They next asked him how large the army was, and for what object it had been collected. His answer was that it consisted of Anabasis at the head of his own forces, and aided by some Chalybian and Tauchian mercenaries. Anabasis had got it together, he added, meaning to attack the Hellenes on the high mountain pass, in a defile which was the sole passage. End of Book 4, Part 2. Book 4, Part 3. Number 5. The next day it was resolved that they should set off with all possible speed, before the enemy had time to collect and occupy the defile. Having got their kit and baggage together, they at once began their march through deep snow with several guides, and, crossing the high pass the same day on which Anabasis was to have attacked them, got safely into cantonments. From this point they marched 3 desert stages, 15 parasangs, to the river Euphrates, and crossed it in water up to the waist. The sources of the river were reported to be at no great distance. From this place they marched through deep snow over a flat country 3 stages, 15 parasangs. The last of these marches was trying, with the north wind blowing in their teeth, drying up everything and benumbing the men. Here one of the seers suggested to them to do sacrifice to Boreas, and sacrifice was done. The effect was obvious to all, in the diminished fierceness of the blast. But there was 6 feet of snow, so that many of the baggage animals and slaves were lost, and about 30 of the men themselves. They spent the whole night in kindling fire, for there was fortunately no dearth of wood at the halting place, only those who came late into camp had no wood. Accordingly, those who had arrived a good while, and had kindled fires, were not for allowing these late-comers near the fires, unless they would in return give a share of their corn, or of any other victuals they might have. Here then a general exchange of goods was set up. Where the fire was kindled the snow melted, and great trenches formed themselves down to the bare earth, and here it was possible to measure the depth of the snow. Leaving these quarters, they marched the whole of the next day over snow, and many of the men were afflicted with bulimia, or hunger faintness. Xenophon, who was guarding the rear, came upon some men who had dropped down, and he did not know what ailed them. But some one who was experienced in such matters suggested to him that they had evidently got bulimia, and if they got something to eat, they would revive. Then he went the round of the baggage train, and laying an embargo on any eatables he could see, doled out with his own hands, or sent off other able-bodied agents to distribute to the sufferers, who as soon as they had taken a mouthful got on their legs again and continued the march. On and on they marched, and about dusk Chrysippus reached a village, and surprised some women and girls who had come from the village to fetch water at the fountain outside the stockade. These asked them who they were. The interpreters answered for them in Persian. They were on their way from the king to the satrap. In reply to which the women gave them to understand that the satrap was not at home, but was away a parasang further on. As it was late they entered with the water carriers within the stockade to visit the headman of the village. Accordingly Chrysippus and as many of the troops as were able got into cantonments there, while the rest of the soldiers, those namely who were unable to complete the march, had to spend the night out, without food and without fire. Under the circumstances, some of the men perished. On the heels of the army hung perpetually bands of the enemy, snatching away disabled baggage animals and fighting with each other over the carcasses. And in its track not seldom were left to their fate disabled soldiers struck down with snow blindness or with toes mortified by frostbite. As to the eyes, it was some alleviation against the snow to march with something black before them. For the feet, the only remedy was to keep in motion without stopping for an instant, and to loose the sandal at night. If they went to sleep with the sandals on, the thong worked into the feet, and the sandals were frozen fast to them. This was partly due to the fact that, since their old sandals had failed, they wore untanned brogues made of newly flayed ox hides. It was owing to some such dire necessity that a party of men fell out and were left behind, and seeing a black-looking patch of ground where the snow had evidently disappeared, they conjectured it must have been melted. And this was actually so, owing to a spring of some sort which was to be seen steaming up in a dell close by. To this they had turned aside and sat down, and were loath to go a step further. But Xenophon, with his rearguard, perceived them, and begged and implored them by all manner of means not to be left behind, telling them that the enemy were after them in large packs pursuing, and he ended by growing angry. They merely bade him put a knife to their throats, not one step further would they stir. Then it seemed best to frighten the pursuing enemy if possible, and prevent their falling upon the invalids. It was already dusk, and the pursuers were advancing with much noise and hubbub, wrangling and disputing over their spoils. Then all of a sudden the rearguard, in the plenitude of health and strength, sprang up out of their lair and run upon the enemy, whilst those weary wights bawled out as loud as their sick throats could sound, and clashed their spears against their shields, and the enemy in terror hurled themselves through the snow into the dell, and not one of them ever uttered a sound again. Xenophon and his party, telling the sick folk that next day people would come for them, set off, and before they had gone half a mile, they fell in with some soldiers who had laid down to rest on the snow with their cloaks wrapped round them, but never a guard was established, and they made them get up. Their explanation was that those in front would not move on. Passing by this group, he sent forward the strongest of his light infantry in advance, with orders to find out what the stoppage was. They reported that the whole army lay reposing in such fashion. That being so, Xenophon's men had nothing for it but to bivouac in the open air also, without fire and supperless, merely posting what pickets they could under the circumstances. But as soon as it drew towards day, Xenophon dispatched the youngest of his men to the sick folk behind, with orders to make them get up, and force them to proceed. Meanwhile, Chrysippus had sent some of his men quartered in the village to inquire how they fared in the rear. They were overjoyed to see them, and handed over the sick folk to them to carry into camp, while they themselves continued their march forward, and ere 20 furlongs were passed, reached the village in which Chrysippus was quartered. As soon as the two divisions were met, the resolution was come to that it would be safe to billet the regiments throughout the villages. Chrysippus remained where he was, while the rest drew lots for the villages in sight, and then, with their several detachments, marched off to their respective destinations. It was here that Polycrates, an Athenian and captain of a company, asked for leave of absence. He wished to be off on a quest of his own, and putting himself at the head of the active men of the division, he ran to the village which had been allotted to Xenophon. He surprised within it the villagers with their headmen, and 17 young horses which were being reared as a tribute for the king, and, last of all, the headman's own daughter, a young bride only 8 days wed. Her husband had gone off to chase hares, and so he escaped being taken with the other villagers. The houses were underground structures with an aperture like the mouth of a well by which to enter, but they were broad and spacious below. The entrance for the beasts of burden was dug out, but the human occupants descended by a ladder. In these dwellings were to be found goats and sheep and cattle, and cocks and hens, with their various progeny. The flocks and herds were all reared under cover upon green food. There were stores within of wheat and barley and vegetables, and wine made from barley in great big bowls. The grains of barley malt lay floating in the beverage up to the lip of the vessel, and reeds lay in them, some longer, some shorter, without joints. When you were thirsty, you must take one of these into your mouth and suck. The beverage, without admixture of water, was very strong, and of a delicious flavour to certain palates, but the taste must be acquired. Xenophon made the headman of the village his guest at supper, and bade him keep a good heart. So far from robbing him of his children, they would fill his house full of good things in return for what they took before they went away. Only he must set them an example, and discover some blessing or other for the army, until they found themselves with another tribe. To this he readily assented, and with the utmost cordiality showed them the cellar where the wine was buried. For this night then, having taken up their several quarters as described, they slumbered in the midst of plenty, one and all, with the headman under watch and ward, and his children with him safe in sight. But on the following day Xenophon took the headman and set off to Chrysippus, making a round of the villages, and at each place turning in to visit the different parties. Everywhere alike he found them faring sumptuously and merry-making. There was not a single village where they did not insist on setting a breakfast before them, and on the same table were spread 6 dishes at least: lamb, kid, pork, veal, fowls, with various sorts of bread, some of wheat and some of barley. When, as an act of courtesy, anyone wished to drink his neighbour's health, he would drag him to the big bowl, and when there he must duck his head and take a long pull, drinking like an ox. The headman, they insisted everywhere, must accept as a present whatever he liked to have, but he would accept nothing except where he espied any of his relations, when he made a point of taking them off, him or her, with himself. When they reached Chrysippus, they found a similar scene. There too the men were feasting in their quarters, garlanded with wisps of hay and dry grass, and Armenian boys were playing the part of waiters in barbaric costumes, only they had to point out by gesture to the boys what they were to do, like deaf and dumb. After the first formalities, when Chrysippus and Xenophon had greeted one another like bosom friends, they interrogated the headman in common by means of the Persian-speaking interpreter. What was the country? They asked. He replied, Armenia. And again, for whom are the horses being bred? They are tribute for the king, he replied. And the neighbouring country is the land of the Chalybes, he said, and he described the road which led to it. So for the present Xenophon went off, taking the headman back with him to his household and friends. He also made him present of an oldish horse which he had got. He had heard that the headman was a priest of the sun, and so he could fatten up the beast and sacrifice him. Otherwise he was afraid it might die outright, for it had been injured by the long marching. For himself he took his pick of the colts, and gave a colt apiece to each of his fellow generals and officers. The horses here were smaller than the Persian horses, but much more spirited. It was here too that their friend the headman explained to them how they should wrap small bags or sacks around the feet of the horses and other cattle when marching through the snow, for without such precautions the creatures sank up to their bellies. Number 6. When a week had passed,
On the 8th day, Xenophon delivered over the guide, that is to say the village headman, to Chrysippus. He left the headman's household safe behind in the village, with the exception of his son, a lad in the bloom of youth. This boy was entrusted to Episthanes of Amphipolis to guard. If the headman proved himself a good guide, he was to take away his son also at his departure. They finally made his house the repository of all the good things they could contrive to get together. Then they broke up their camp and commenced to march, the headman guiding them through the snow unfettered. When they had reached the 3rd stage, Chrysippus flew into a rage with him, because he had not brought them to any villages. The headman pleaded that there were none in this part. Chrysippus struck him, but forgot to bind him, and the end of it was that the headman ran away in the night and was gone, leaving his son behind him. This was the sole ground of difference between Chrysippus and Xenophon during the march, this combination of ill treatment and neglect in the case of the guide. As to the boy, Episthanes conceived a passion for him, and took him home with him, and found in him the most faithful of friends. After this, they marched 7 stages at the rate of 5 parasangs a day, to the banks of the river Phasis, which is 100 feet broad, and thence they marched another couple of stages, 10 parasangs. But at the pass leading down into the plain there appeared in front of them a mixed body of Chalybes and Touchians and Phasianians. When Chrysippus caught sight of the enemy on the pass at a distance of about 3 or 4 miles, he ceased marching, not caring to approach the enemy with his troops in column, and he passed down the order to the others, to deploy their companies to the front, that the troops might form into line. As soon as the rear guard had come up, he assembled the generals and officers, and addressed them: "The enemy, as you see, are in occupation of the mountain pass. It is time we should consider how we are to make the best fight to win it. My opinion is, that we should give orders to the troops to take their morning meal, whilst we deliberate whether we should cross the mountains today or tomorrow." "My opinion," said Cleonor, "is that as soon as we have breakfasted, we should arm for the fight and attack the enemy without loss of time, for if we fritter away today, the enemy who are now content to look at us will grow bolder, and with their growing courage, depend upon it, others more numerous will join them." After him, Xenophon spoke. "This," he said, "is how I see the matter. If fight we must, let us make preparation to sell our lives dearly. But if we desire to cross with the greatest ease, the point to consider is, how we may get the fewest wounds and throw away the smallest number of good men. Well then, that part of the mountain which is visible stretches nearly 7 miles. Where are the men posted to intercept us? Except at the road itself, they are nowhere to be seen. It is much better to try if possible to steal a point of this desert mountain unobserved, and before they know where we are, secure the prize, than to fly at a strong position and an enemy thoroughly prepared, since it is much easier to march up a mountain without fighting than to tramp along a level when assailants are at either hand, and provided he has not to fight, a man will see what lies at his feet much more plainly even at night than in broad daylight in the midst of battle, and a rough road to feet that roam in peace may be pleasanter than a smooth surface with the bullets whistling about your ears. Nor is it so impossible, I take it, to steal a march, since it is open to us to go by night, when we cannot be seen, and fall back so far that they will never notice us. In my opinion, however, if we make a feint of attacking here, we shall find the mountain chain all the more deserted elsewhere, since the enemy will be waiting for us here in thicker swarm. But what right have I to be drawing conclusions about stealing in your presence, Chrysippus? For you Lacedaemonians, as I have often been told, you who belong to the peers, practice stealing from your boyhood up, and it is no disgrace, but honourable rather to steal, except such things as the law forbids, and in order, I presume, to stimulate your sense of secretiveness, and to make you master thieves, it is lawful for you further to get a whipping if you are caught. Now then, you have a fine opportunity of displaying your training. But take care we are not caught stealing over the mountain, or we shall catch it ourselves." "For all that," retorted Chrysippus, "I have heard that you Athenians are clever hands at stealing the public moneys, and that too though there is a fearful risk for the person so employed. But, I am told, it is your best men who are addicted to it, if it is your best men who are thought worthy to rule. So it is a fine opportunity for yourself also, Xenophon, to exhibit your education." "And I," replied Xenophon, "am ready to take the rear division, as soon as we have supped, and seize the mountain chain. I have already got guides, for the light troops laid an ambuscade, and seized some of the cut-purse vagabonds who hung on our rear. I am further informed by them that the mountain is not inaccessible, but is grazed by goats and cattle, so that if we can once get hold of any portion of it, there will be no difficulty as regards our animals. They can cross. As to the enemy, I expect they will not even wait for us any longer, when they once see us on a level with themselves on the heights, for they do not even at present care to come down and meet us on fair ground." Chrysippus answered, "But why should you go and leave your command in the rear? Send others rather, unless a band of volunteers will present themselves." Thereupon Aristonymus the Methydrian came forward with some heavy infantry, and Nicomachus the Oetian with another body of light troops, and they made an agreement to kindle several watch-fires as soon as they held the heights. The arrangements made, they breakfasted, and after breakfast Chrysippus advanced the whole army 10 furlongs closer towards the enemy, so as to strengthen the impression that he intended to attack them at that point. But as soon as they had supped and night had fallen, the party under orders set off and occupied the mountain, while the main body rested where they were. Now as soon as the enemy perceived that the mountain was taken, they banished all thought of sleep, and kept many watch-fires blazing through the night. But at break of day Chrysippus offered sacrifice, and began advancing along the road, while the detachment which held the mountain advanced pari passu by the high ground. The larger mass of the enemy, on his side, remained still on the mountain pass, but a section of them turned to confront the detachment on the heights. Before the main bodies had time to draw together, the detachment on the height came to close quarters, and the Hellenes were victorious and gave chase. Meanwhile the light division of the Hellenes, issuing from the plain, were rapidly advancing against the serried lines of the enemy, whilst Chrysippus followed up with his heavy infantry at quick march. But the enemy on the road no sooner saw their higher division being worsted than they fled, and some few of them were slain, and a vast number of wicker shields were taken, which the Hellenes hacked to pieces with their short swords, and rendered useless. So when they had reached the summit of the pass, they sacrificed, and set up a trophy, and descending into the plain, reached villages abounding in good things of every kind. End of Book 4, Part 3.